Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, What is Life After Coronavirus? Leading the Reentry Process, presented by Ray & Associates, a top 100 regional CPA and business consulting firm with offices across Ohio. My name is Imani Fields, and I'll be moderating today's presentation. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items to cover. First, if you have any questions during today's presentation, you may enter them into the chat box onto your screen. We'll be working to respond to as many questions as we can during today's presentation. If we're unable to answer your question during today's webinar, we will make it a point to follow up with you as soon as we can. Additionally, you are welcome to email your questions directly to us at raynews@raycpa.com. If you are registered for today's webinar, you will also receive the recording of today's presentation, as well as a link to a very short evaluation. Please take a few minutes to share your thoughts about the presentation as a whole, the information provided, and our presenters. Your feedback is important as we determine future webinar topics related to the current COVID-19 crisis. Also, if you'd like a copy of today's slides, you'll find that they're available in the handout section of the webinar dashboard on your computer screen. Today's webinar will be given by Annie Yoder and Gage. As a principal and director of development at Ray & Associates, Annie is responsible for overseeing leadership, development, and succession planning initiatives across the multi-office firm. Annie has more than 15 years of experience in the accounting industry, and her areas of expertise include employee development, leadership, government auditing, internal controls, and risk assessment. Guy is the owner of PartnersCoach, a coaching and consulting firm for professionals in private practice. Holding a license in counseling with an emphasis on human performance improvement, he has consulted and coached CPAs for almost 20 years, guiding them to increase their effectiveness and career satisfaction. Today, Annie and Guy will discuss what you should be aware of as you prepare to re-enter the market, as well as policies and procedures you should consider amid the existing COVID-19 crisis. And I am going to pass it on to you, Annie.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll step in here. Imani, thanks so much for that introduction, and thank you to each of you on this webinar today. As you know, Ray has had a long series of webinars regarding coronavirus, and today our focus is really on leading through crisis. Whether that's the coronavirus or another crisis that we will eventually run into, we really, again, want to focus on leadership through this and how we can help you and give you some guidance in that area. I've had the pleasure of working with Guy for many years, and he knows people. He knows how to dive into the development of people, and he has helped our organization get through many difficult things throughout the firm. The other things I want to tell you guys just quickly before we jump into the details are, we're not going to get too much into the tactical. Our focus, again, is leadership. The other piece is, too, there is a ripple effect with your decision making. So as we get through this, please keep that frame of reference in mind, that any decisions you make will have a ripple effect both internally and externally. So Guy, did you want to give a quick intro?
Yes, thank you, Annie. I think it's important to know that what my orientation is, not being a CPA or having anything to do with the accounting profession, but I spent a lot of time with CPAs and other professional service providers. But I approach it from a human behavior and human motivation perspective. That's my experience, my background, my license, and how does the human factor affect business? And it's particularly in this time of a very unusual time in business. So that'll be kind of the context in which I'll be sharing my thoughts.
Thank you. That's a very good point. And just to give a little background as well, you heard my intro, and I might sound like I'm a little confused on my career path, but I have also been involved in many different areas and have experience with different industries. And so this is not CPA focused. This is about you on the other side of this webinar and what we can give, the tools and items that we can give you to help you through this crisis. So if we could jump forward, next slide. Today we're going to focus on spurring your thought process. We just want you guys to start thinking about what we need to be doing and tying back to some of the information that is out there, it can get very chaotic and very cluttered very quickly. So we want to give you a framework and some ideas as you get through this process. If you can jump forward for me there. Let's start with cautions. What to watch out for? What roadblocks do you need to watch? First and foremost, the best analogy that I've heard regarding re-entry or return to work is we pushed people out with a light switch. We pushed them out the door very quickly if you had the capability for people to work from home, or if you were required to shut your organization down. What you really need to think about is the dimmer approach on bringing your people back. Don't rush it. Put thought into it. Get those teams together and start gathering information. The other piece is all your knowledge, all your experience, although you can draw on it, we've never seen a crisis like this. None of us on this webinar have been through a crisis of this magnitude that affects the entire globe. So how can you take your experience and find parallels of this situation to draw on? So your policies, your procedures that may have been very rigid in the past now need to flex. They need to bend. You need to figure out if, for example, your core working hours were 8 to 5. Does that work for the next 8 to 12 to 18 months? Can you flex those core working hours? So be flexible. Absolutely be flexible. If you are an organization that tends to be a little more rigid because of what you do as an organization, there's a constant balance. So continue to start to use those words as you put your plan together. Embrace flexibility and start to bend those policies where you can, obviously while still remaining compliant with those HR laws and things like HIPAA compliance, et cetera, where you cannot bend the rules. You could jump to the next slide for me. So this graph, I think, is pretty powerful because what we're living in is a bit of a paradox. And everything that we do in our organizations as leaders is on a continuum. So you're going to have individuals in your organization, in every organization, on the continuum of, I'm going to continue to live my life like I did before COVID-19, to I'm going to go in a bunker. So there is the continuum in between there, and you will find that you could plot all your folks on that continuum. Now the answer is, where are you as a leader going to make those decisions so that you won't make everybody happy, but that you can set your minimum to appease and to mitigate your risk? This graph right here shows you a little bit that, again, everything's on a continuum from, you hear things like effectiveness and efficiency. They counter each other, right? Well, sometimes your business focus and your people focus tend to counter each other. Organizations tend to be either transactional or relational. So think about that for a minute. Are you a transactional organization or are you a relational organization? And now in this setting, in this crisis, where do you need to be on that continuum? You have that high business focus and a high people focus, you likely have really good alignment and really good business strategy that can continue to be executed. So this graphic is really here for you to ponder, where are we on this continuum normally, and where do we need to be today to get us through this crisis? Next slide. Guy, as we move forward, can you share, the organizations that tend to be a little more people focused or maybe a little more business focused, right? They intertwine with each other so intimately. Can you share a little bit with the group where they should dive in on knowing their people as they get through this process?
Yes, very much so. And I really appreciate your comment, Annie, about the fact that when people were asked to stay home and to go home, and stay home, go home, it happened suddenly. And what we found was that people had to figure it out. Now, for those who are comfortable and working at home, they had the ability, the physical space to do so. Their work allowed them to do so. and it was something that was possible and they were familiar with. For them, it was less of a arduous task. For others, it was probably the first time they'd ever been asked to do so. And it can be incredibly stressful as a result of that. But the most important thing that I think you have to understand is that the people that were sent home a few weeks ago are not going to be the same people who return. Now, when I wrote that out and I thought about it, I thought this reminds me of that old movie that I saw when I was just a young kid. I think it was called Body Snatchers or something like that. And people were being, I don't know, they were different people than what they were supposed to be. And I just vaguely remember the story. These are going to look like the same people, but they are not going to be the same people. And what I want to emphasize is why that's the case. And if you understand what they're bringing back to the workplace, it might make it easier for you as you continue to lead them through this chaos. So let's kind of take a quick look at it. 24-hour news cycle of the economic turmoil, the business failings, sick and dying totals, both internationally, nationally, statewide, and then even locally. You add to that tremendous bad news, if you will, this idea that so many of the people that are supposed to know don't know. And so we've had conflicting advice and conflicting direction. And people are wondering, so what should I be doing here? What is really the focus here? I know that there have been several things, practices that I adapted to, and then come to find out they weren't nearly as important as they once were said to be, or actually contradictory. I should be doing something else. So these kinds of disruptions really cause a problem for people, and they struggle with how to make sense of it all. I also have to emphasize that for some, this is really maybe more of a positive experience for them. You know, when you stop and think about it, they didn't have travel time going to and from work. I know for me, I've saved on my gas bill. I haven't filled up my tank since I've been here because I haven't gone anywhere, or very few places anyway. So no traffic, no frustration of travel time and all that preparation. The other thing that we know for some people, they really kind of got into this idea that, you know, I have some autonomy in my workday. If I don't want to work about 45 minutes and then pause and go and put the clothes from the washer into the dryer and then come back to work, well, I can do that. And they kind of enjoyed this mix, if you will, of the personal and the professional that they didn't have available to them. Other things include a relaxing or more relaxing routines. They didn't have any rigid expectations to meet. They had a little bit more flexibility, and they kind of enjoyed that. Blending the work and family obligations together was another thing that for some actually ended up being a real positive, but for others, not so much. So I want to talk a little bit about the actual anxiety that people were experiencing. And it has to do with this whole returning to work. We've kind of been pent up to this point. And we know from, I know from a lot of my clinical friends, anxiety and complaints of anxiety and other distressful afflictions are on the rise. And it's frankly, it's unsettling. And that's basically a good word. I think everyone has experienced at some level being unsettled, because we know that whatever we're into now at home is temporary. And we're going to begin in the next weeks to enter back into the workforce. And that's going to create some difficulty there. But when they return to work, what are their apprehensions going to be? Well, first and foremost, what we're hearing is that they're fearful of being infected themselves. That is a huge effort. We have been sequestered, many have been sequestered and have not ventured out. And for the ones who are considered necessary businesses and have been able to be out, I think their tolerance of what things are really there and how fearful they should be are not as nearly as high of an effort as it is going to be for those stepping into it who have been at home. The other thing that they're fearful of is bringing the virus home, especially if they have compromised immune system family members. We have all kinds of anxieties around keeping people safe, especially the ones that are under our care. If that were it, that wouldn't be quite as bad, but then every single one of our family members have their own reentry process. Our young children are going to go back to daycare. Our school-age children are going to go back to the classroom and schools, as well as adults in our either spouse or adult children. They're going back to jobs. And so they have their own reentry process. And so people are going to be very consumed with the idea of how is it working? How are they doing? And so as a result of all this, please do not be surprised if your people experience a level of edginess. They're distracted. They may even be irritable, short fuse, or the opposite side, they may just be lethargic, worn out from it all. Point of all this is the people who left are not going to be the same who arrive back. And so being a leader is really a challenge. And what makes it even more challenging is that everyone comes with their own story, with their own experience. Some, many, in fact, are probably the first few days are going to be elated because they want to come back to some sense of normalcy. What they're going to find out, though, is that what was normal at one time can no longer be considered, quote, normal. We have other protocols, other safety precautions, other things we're going to do, or things we used to do we're not going to do any longer. And so I think any kind of short-term, thank goodness we're back to work, will soon give way to, oh my gosh, we really are in a new normal. We're going to have to figure this out in a whole different way. Point is, and I think Annie mentioned this to me, she said, one size fits one. And I really like that, Annie. And so maybe you can kind of tell us a little bit more about when you said that. There's obviously a huge backstory behind it.
Yeah, I'll just share with you because I think of our clients and our non-clients and those in the variety of experience that are listening to this. And that whether you are a manufacturing organization or a construction organization, your employees, the people that have boots on the ground, they all have a story. They could have daycare issues through July. They could have been on unemployment and dealing with going through that system. They could have a sick parent. It's one size fits one because everybody's story is just a little bit different. And that's why it makes it difficult to cover when you're pulling people back in. It makes it very difficult to make blanket statements because sometimes, again, those policies have to bend. So the point of that one size fits one is listen, make sure that you have not just your ears open as a leader, but you're asking your managers and others in your organization to listen intently so that you can start to frame your reentry process around what you're hearing. Because there might have to be tweaks, again, that one size fits one. I understand that every organization has to make some minimal standards because you can't operate without those minimal standards because that would be a bad business decision. But ultimately still consider what those employees are going through.
Good point. Yeah, thank you, Annie. So not only knowing your people, but finally, I think it's good to have some resources already identified. And I think we'll speak to this in a little later, but just briefly, there are a lot of organizations, the Center of Disease Control, your health department at the state level, as well as your local authorities they're constantly keeping you aware and have information that you should be taking advantage of. And I think what happens is sometimes we can get so involved and absorbed in the business of what we're about that sometimes we lose sight of these other factors.
Yeah, before we jump forward, I know we're ready to jump into the psychological safety, but from a resource standpoint, I just want to put a shout out to EAPs, Employee Assistance Programs, because if you have one, fantastic. If you don't, call your insurance company. Find out if you have access to an EAP, because it is incredibly valuable as a resource for your employees, especially from an anxiety and stress standpoint. It's an independent party that they can reach out to and grab onto resources to help them through this process.
Good point. Thank you, Annie. Yeah, so when we talk about the people side of it, and that's kind of, again, what my contribution to this webinar is you have to look at the psychological framework in which people are coming back to, and you as a leader have an opportunity to influence that in a significant sort of way. So what we know from the research is that the psychological and emotional behavioral aspects of the human makeup are really driven by some different factors. And I've identified 4 here. One thing I want to say, though, about this, this slide here, and that is that all of these factors are illusions. And what I mean to say by that is, you know, we're not really in control. We thought we were in much more control than what we are. We thought life was so much more stable than what it actually is. Our sense of certainty of what we could count on and the clarity around what we should do next, well, we had life worked out just fine. Think back the end of last year and the beginning of this year when you're finalizing and beginning to execute your strategic plan. We want 2020 to look like this and to be this successful. We all had our lives worked out. And come to find out, it didn't happen that way. And so when I say it's illusion, I don't want to dismiss the importance of it, because certainly it is. What I do want to say, though, is you as a leader have an opportunity to give people the substance or the evidence that, in fact, they do have more control, more certainty, more clarity than maybe what they feel right now. And so I want to kind of walk through each one of these that might be helpful for you to be thinking about how you can give people that greater sense of control. We don't have control over what happens internationally. We do have control over what happens to us personally and collectively as a work team, whether it's a division, a department, an office, or whatever. So one of the things about control is feeling like I have input. The belief that I am weighing in, my voice is heard, things are that concern me are being elevated. Does not at all mean that people are going to get their way, but there's something to be said about being given the opportunity to speak, offer their opinion. Surveys are just incredibly valuable. Quick checks. I know one firm, they did an exercise where it was one question every day. They came in that morning and the question was around some aspect of what they were doing, and at the end of the day it was tabulated and then presented at the end of the day. Well, what happened was people, and let me step back, the questions were all around how can we make this better? How can we solve this problem? Not what problems are there. And so at the end of the day, we had this summary of great thinking and ideas of what you know your workforce is considering. The other thing it did is all through the day, that was part of the chatter. What do you think the solution should be on this particular thing? How can we accomplish this one thing that was part of our question? And so you start engaging people, and that addresses that whole need and sense for control. Stability is the ability to have confidence that we have something there. Regular check-ins, meeting as a whole firm, meeting as a whole company, whether or just as your team meeting on a regular basis, whatever your work group is. I know one of my clients is there are probably 170 people among 4 or 5 offices, and what they found was that they felt it necessary to have a daily morning check-in. They did a video conference, much like what we're doing now, and they were all in attendance. And the CEO gave their the latest of what they knew, what they understood. It brought people together. They got a chance to reinforce the message, which we'll talk about in a minute. But the idea is creating a sense of stability, of normalcy, if you will, in an unnormal setting. Certainty is exactly that. What can I count on going forward? What should my schedule this week look like? Have people put short-term goals together, both for the day as well as for the week. Making sure assignments make sense and they're comfortable in that they know what the assignments are. And anything you can do to bring familiarity is obviously going to be to your advantage. People with the illusory belief that things are more stable than what they felt like when I was home listening to the 24-hour news cycle, that's comforting. Clarity is really about what we should be paying attention to now. Priorities that were in place 6 weeks ago, they probably have changed. And if they haven't, they certainly need to be revisited. And maybe not the priority itself, but maybe the sequence of it or how we're going to approach it. There's a lot of different adjustments and adaptations that are going to have to be made. And when Annie spoke earlier about the need to be flexible, this is what we're talking about. Be willing to say the plans that we developed the end of last year and began implementing this year, they were made in a different time. We are not the same company. We are not the same market. We are not the same country as we once were. What needs to be adjusted and adapted? So that whole area of clarity is really the emphasis of bringing people to a sense of, okay, I've got my arms around this and I feel much more safe, secure in this place. That is all driven by leader insistence on the part of your managers and others to participate.
And I think, Guy, I'll just chime in there too. I think it's valuable to understand you are articulating that this is about communication. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But in the absence of framing your story as a leader, your employees, again, it doesn't matter what organization they're in. I don't care if you're a 3-person shop or a 4,000-person shop. If you aren't framing the message is getting framed for you. So how do you want your employees to get clarity? How do you want them to feel stability and certainty and control? That is up to the leader and the leadership team and those you pull in to start framing the story for your employees.
Excellent point. Excellent.
Yeah.
Next slide.
Before we actually jump into the framework, I wanted to, Amani, would you be able to pop that first poll question up so we can hopefully engage our audience a bit?
Oh, yeah.
You guys could just take about 30 seconds and answer that for us. We're just trying to get an understanding of the size of the organization that we're talking to today.
All right, it's looking like 24% are saying more than 12, 22% are saying 13 to 25, 8% are saying 26 to 44, 18% are saying 45 to 75, and 28% are saying more than 76.
We're quite spread out there, Guy, with the group that's on the phone, but I think it's important to note that what we're talking about applies to all of you and can be scaled to all of you. What we're talking about here is not diving in and spending thousands and thousands of dollars on anything to get through this process. This is about mindset and framework and understanding your people. Before we jump into the next, Guy, did you want to add anything to that about the poll?
Yes. When I work with clients of all different sizes, as Ray does, and one of the things that people misunderstand is literally that people are people. And whether you all are in a small organization or in a large organization, it doesn't matter. Now, the details, the specifics may matter, but in the end, it's really all about people. And that's the one constant we have in this midst of change. We can do an awful lot of guessing and predicting about how people are going to respond, which is why we're even having this webinar. You can pretty much be assured that you're going to see an awful lot of what we've been describing. And the second thing is we actually have a poll following the previous slide that I wanted to get into as well. And maybe we can go ahead and do that poll as well. This is a poll on of those 4 areas that we just discussed, the control, stability, certainty, and clarity. Which one of these do you think, just from hearing a brief description, that you need to spend a little bit more time paying attention to? Maybe you hadn't thought of or considered to the degree that maybe you need to. And we'll see what the results come back on that.
All right, it looks like it says 10% control, 34% stability, 17% certainty, and 38% clarity.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I think what's fantastic about that, I mean, we have a spread, of course, but the fact that we have people, you can tell that they're starting to think about their story and wrapping clarity around their reentry process, which is pretty fantastic. And so I guess I think we're ready to dive into the next part of this. And what we want to share with you really is framework. We are using the framework, and we've seen other organizations use a framework similar to this of plan, prepare, lead. These are going to go on through this process simultaneously and continuously. So at any point, you're going to have to pivot as a leader. You might be planning one thing, and the governor issues an order that causes you to pivot. We've all experienced in the last 3 days the change from mandatory masks to required. You know, I don't know the specific language, but you know, that was a pivot on our government's part at the state level. So we had one plan. Guess what? We're going to pivot and we'll go to a different one. So what we want to share with you really is, it doesn't have to be plan, prepare, lead, but what is your framework that you're going to walk into this planning process with? Don't go at it without thinking about what framework matches you as an organization. If you are an 8-person organization, it might be as simple as plan, prepare, lead, and they're all happening simultaneously. So Guy, can you get us into a little bit more about the planning process?
Sure. This is really all about getting ready for the big entry. So much has to happen ahead of time beforehand. And I think what we find is that in that planning process, people have, leaders particularly, that's where I want to emphasize. And when I say leaders, I'm not just talking about the C-suite. I'm speaking of also your leaders throughout the organization. You have people who are leading little small teams, but they have a leadership role, and involving them in this planning process of what we're going to do, what to expect, how we're going to proceed has got to be thought through and developed ahead of time, or else it's just not going to create much of an opportunity. You're going to be constantly reacting. So someone comes in and they're very upset and angry about the fact that they have to return to work. Well, you don't want to have to just react to that in the moment. You would be much better served anticipating, okay, if this happens, how should we respond? That kind of being prepared, planning ahead of time and knowing what's going on is really critical. The setting the tone is something that we've talked a lot about, particularly not only in terms of your communication plan, but in how you carry yourself. Do you have confidence at all in what's going to go forward? Well, part of you shouldn't have a whole lot of confidence because we just don't know. How do you have confidence and not know? Well, when you do your strategic thinking, when you do a lot of your 2 and 3 year projections, you're pretty much doing exactly that. There are a lot of unknowns, but rather than being paralyzed by the unknowns, we should be empowered by the knowns. We know certain things are going to happen. We know certain people are going to have need for your product, for your service. It may look different, but nonetheless, it's going to be there. How do we gear our people thinking about themselves in such a way that they are contributing to this idea based on what your tone is? Are you encouraging, inspiring? Are you someone that you want to follow and to be followed, or not? This whole idea of vulnerability is simply accepting the fact that we're going to go forward with certain assumptions based on the best information we have, and we're going to be flexible and adapt as we go. Communication, on the other hand, is something that has to happen on a regular basis. I have to chuckle when I watch the daily briefings at the national level, the state level, and at the local regional levels. And these briefings, individuals have this idea that there must be great orators and people love hearing what they have to say, when it's probably not so much that they're so good at that. It's probably more so that people are anxious, they want to know. You cannot ever over communicate in a time of turmoil. You can't do it. And so when this firm told me that they were having daily check-in meetings, the entire firm phoned in to this video conference every day, I thought, my gosh, what do you talk about? How does that work? They were amazed at the people who said, this is great, we love it, we have to have it, we want it to continue on. And again, it wasn't because Mark was such a great CEO, which he is, he's a great CEO, but what it really is, it's about their need to hear from their leaders, to be communicated with, and not just the leader, their team leaders as well. So your managers need to hear from you, and your managers need to speak to the leaders. You don't have to know it all and be it all and do it all. You just simply have to be able to communicate with transparency and with humility.
I think I'll just jump in there real quickly too. I know organizations might be thinking, well, I don't have Zoom, I don't have that technology to do those things. If you are an organization, you can actually FaceTime with multiple people. If you have iPhone now, technology does play a part, but can you text message? Do your people respond via text message? Is it a short, can you get it in a small few sentences that, quite frankly, I'm just thinking about you and we are planning accordingly? It could be that simple. So again, I just want to keep reiterating that you as a business owner, as a CEO, as a leader, you can make this scalable to your organization. There's ways to do it that it doesn't have to be a big, arduous process.
Excellent point. I recommend that every person in your workforce be contacted by a manager, their manager, just to ask, how are you doing?
Mm-hmm.
Not work related, not are you meeting the deadlines, not how's the progress on that project, none of that, but just simply, I just want to check in. We've had a busy week or we're getting ready to get into the weekend. What do you think? What are your plans? How are you managing? That kind of people connection goes back to the focus that Annie showed in that matrix where we had a heavy people focus. People need to know that they're not just simply a cog in some wheel that is operating and they're just a part of the grind, but they are individuals and their leaders care about them. So that constant, consistent messaging and the regular being in touch with them as human beings, as people, it just pays dividends. Some of you, by nature, do that already. And you're probably scratching your head thinking, well, why would anyone even have to say that? Well, there's another whole population of leaders that just doesn't cross their minds. They're so task focused and so directed on making progress, achieving goals, and being successful that it's not that they don't care, it just doesn't elevate to their thinking. It needs to be there regardless and can be there as well. And then the team approach, which is basically that. I think the more people feel empowered and are a part of the process, the more you can engage them and involve them. To that end, you're going to have a higher level of participation.
Absolutely. I think it's important for us to understand, again, as leaders, that it doesn't have to be people just inside your organization. What peers have you reached out to? If you take nothing else away from this webinar, here's what I would give you. Pick up the phone and call your peers, because especially in a crisis, people are willing to share. They're willing to share resources. They're willing to share what they're doing, so you don't have to recreate the wheel. So please don't feel like you're alone. Use your peers, use your advisors, reach out beyond the walls of your organization to help you. So if we could skip ahead here to the prepare process, I want to make sure that we continue to flow through this. So Guy talked about planning. Let's talk about a little bit about preparation. We won't get into too much detail. Jump ahead for me if you could. We want to just quickly think in categories. So what categories, as you're going through this, we talked about a major framework for crisis planning. Now let's get into the preparation process. Again, what's our framework, or what are the buckets that we're going to work in? Safety and health. Did you think 6 months ago you were going to be concerned about how many Clorox wipes you had in your organization? My guess is the answer is a big no. But today you have to be. You have to be worried about cleaning supplies and what you have. In the state of Ohio, our governor is asking that we have a 3-week supply on hand so that we can continue and to have the proper cleaning process in our organizations. And again, depending on what kind of organization you are, this could be a huge, huge undertaking, depending on what you're doing. So thinking about the safety and health, get individuals that normally might have an administrative function or that you might think are leaders in their own right without title to help you think through this. Because as a leader, as soon as you make a decision, someone's going to come back to you and go, well, you didn't think of this, this, and this. You won't think of everything, but if you can get feedback from those folks, for instance, I've heard of organizations bringing in a lot of their administrative functions to allow them the resources to give them feedback so that they can have a say in it. Operations, think about your scheduling, and physical space. I'll just spend, again, 2 minutes on this. Take a step back, get your head of maintenance, or maybe it's you, because I'm again guessing you were the owner, the janitor, the AP, AR, you're wearing all those hats at different times. Make sure you're thinking about your physical space and how that needs to be set up to adhere to whatever restrictions there may be, like physical distancing. You hear social distancing all the time, and I heard something wonderful. There has not been a greater time that we need to socially connect. I like physical distancing a whole lot better than I like social distancing, because now is not the time to social distance. Now is the time to physical distance. So think again about your physical space as you're going through this. And then finally, and one of the most important things, what happens if you have an active case of COVID-19 in your organization? Do you have a response plan? Doesn't matter how big or how small, you absolutely need to have a plan in place so that you're not trying to scramble at the 11th hour when you find out someone has contracted COVID-19, that you have that in place. You can pick that piece of paper up and you know, this is our protocol. I need to tell these people, I need to make this phone call, we need to shut down, we need to clean, whatever those steps are, have that response in place as you're going through this. So the last piece of the framework we want to get through here quickly and is to lead. And we've been talking about it through this entire webinar, and it's been intertwined with all that we've done. Guy, I'll flip it back over to you to get through that last section.
Sure. Thank you, Annie. You're starting to hear some common themes, and you're going to hear them in this slide, particularly as a leader. This is probably as good a directive for you as a leader as any of the slides. First and foremost, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Max Dupree. He's a great leadership guru out on the West Coast, and has written a number of books. Wonderful guy. I just love his quotes. But he made this statement once: the first order of a leader is to define reality. And what he meant to say by that is, if people come back the first day and they hear from you, oh gosh, I don't know how we're going to manage through this. We're going to have to all pull together, and hopefully if we cross our fingers and things go our way, we'll be able to survive. Well, I'm telling you, that's a heck of a way of defining reality that is not at all inspiring. How do you define reality? What kind of words do you use? We've talked about this already, the tone and your verbiage. What do you really want people to believe and to understand? Up to and including, you know what? We have done this before. We have been through a difficult time before. We are a good collection of smart people. We're flexible. We know what we're doing. We can manage through this. It's going to take all of us, but we can do this. It's an entirely different message. And once you define that reality, people then begin conforming their personal mental and emotional selves to that, which shapes their behavior. They're going to start living into the reality that you define. And Annie couldn't have been more articulate when she said, and if you don't define it, it's going to be defined. And if you're going to leave the defining of reality up to someone else, either in your organization or outside of your organization, then you're missing a great opportunity to assert your leadership. Now, that takes some thought. You've got to be clear. You've got to wrap it into your mission and your purpose for being. All the values and cultural norms that are important to you all, that all gets rolled into how you define reality. Please take the time to define reality. Annie already mentioned about breaking down the silos, putting people into teams, cross-functional conversations. Everyone uses the kitchen. Everyone uses the Keurig machine. Everyone uses the water cooler, the coffee machine, the common shared spaces. We don't need to be siloed for that. Why? Because we're people. We're people hanging together going through. The more you can be visible, the better off you're going to be. 2 years ago, you'll remember that Facebook went through it wasn't nearly a data breach. It was one of their partners who extracted an awful lot of Facebook data for their own usage. Cambridge Analytica was a company that just basically took a bunch of information from Facebook, millions of Facebook people, and use them to their advantage. That was bad enough. What was really unsettling was Mark Zuckerberg was crickets for days. It seems to me it was 3 days before he surfaced. And every night on the news, well, 24-hour news cycle going through, they spent every moment they could defining reality. This is what really happened. This is the problem at Facebook. This is why Facebook isn't good. And Mark let the other people outside the organization to define reality. But the real sad part was the people in the organization were scrambling. Where is our leader? How come we don't know what's going on? Being visible and vulnerable by saying, I don't know the answer to that, but you know what? That is the number one question that we're going to be responding to and finding an answer to. Again, over communicating can't be stated enough. They need to hear from you on a regular basis, a constant, consistent message. The last one is what I think is really important, which is leading through competing priorities. You are going to have competing priorities. You're going to have business needs and you're going to have people needs. And sometimes they're just not going to sync up. And what I hear leaders say is, well, I just got to choose. And so some people choose the business side and it looks like they don't care about their people. Or they put an overemphasis on their people and they allow business productivity and profitability to slide. As a leader, you've got to learn to deal with these competing priorities by asking people to contribute, to weigh in. How do we pay attention to our business and the business needs while accommodating what our people need at this moment? And put it out there as a real conundrum. That is perfectly fine, perfectly legitimate. And someone says, well, you don't care about people. You say, yes, I do care about people. I want to know, help me, how can we care about our people and still maintain a strong, profitable business presence? Mm-hmm. Or flip it the other way. Leading through competing priorities is a leader skill that the more you use it and involve other people, the better off you're going to be.
Wonderful, Guy. I think that is the perfect segue into wrapping this up, giving a few points in summary. So if you can jump ahead and then we'll open it up for a few questions. And if we don't get them answered, we'll certainly answer those via email. So what Guy just said is, in summary, you have to embrace uncertainty as a leader. You have to embrace the paradox that you're living in because you can't have it both ways or it's going to teeter-totter depending on the day and sometimes, quite frankly, the minute. A couple other takeaways are give yourself some grace during this process and give others grace during this process. We are all human and we are all trying. Use your team, use your peers, use your advocates, use your advisors. Don't stay insulated in this time. Reach out and ask for help. And finally, remember the ripple effect that your decisions will have. Whatever those are, just remember it's not going to stay inside your walls. So we know that all of you out there are going to do your best to lead through this crisis because of that ripple effect. All right. Guy, anything else? I think we're going to jump into questions if we have a few minutes. Okay.
All right. Thanks, guys. The question that we have here is practical reasons a face covering cannot be worn, and what are those? Safety glasses are required and masks fog them, causing dangerous situations. One of my employees gets panic attacks with it on. Are those practical?
So the governor announced yesterday, and I don't want to get into the details because I'm going to have to give a shout out to Renee West, HR consultant with Ray, and Darlene Finzer. They're doing a webinar tomorrow, and I think it's at 10:30 in the morning. They're getting very tactical answering questions like this, but I will tell you the governor announced yesterday if there's medical reasons or safety reasons as to why someone can't wear a mask, that's a valid reason not to wear one. But I would also recommend go out on coronavirus.ohio.gov and make sure you're looking at that information. But they did announce that yesterday. They kind of pulled back on the mandatory, at least in the state of Ohio. Remember, it's very state driven, so make sure that you're looking at your state information. We're in Ohio, Guy's actually in West Virginia, so the guidance that they're receiving is probably a little bit different.
And if anybody else has any more questions, feel free to send them now. I'm thinking we launched that last poll to allow people to send in their answers to the chat box. Okay. So this last poll here, what have we talked about today that you would like to hear more about in another webinar? And go ahead and answer in the chat box on your screen, or if you would like to email us later, you can contact us at Ray News. And then if you have any other questions, I'm sorry, not Ray.news, or not Ray News, it's Ray.news. So make sure you guys put the dot in there. That was a typo. And we'll give you guys a couple seconds to answer in the chat box.
As people are filling in the chat box, I'd like to just really re-emphasize the critical role of the leader. The leader has an opportunity to shape reality, not just define it. And this is your chance to really come through. The great leaders throughout history have always taken the adverse situations they found themselves and presented it in such a way that inspired people to rise above not only the adversity, but also their present level of functioning and thinking and behaving, and to a much higher level. And it truly is inspirational for leaders to take that opportunity and to make that kind of a difference, not only with your people, but with your clients and customers, and with your community.
Thank you, guys. And a few things we see in here is organizational communication, response plan for active corona case in the office. So thank you guys for sending those in, and we'll be sure to try to do something around those topics. I'm going to give you guys, Annie and Guy, an opportunity to say, any last words, and then I'll conclude the presentation.
I would just add, thank you for your time. I know it's precious. Leading through crisis certainly can be difficult. There's lots of resources out there to help. And then again, from a tactical standpoint, I know that we're sharing a lot of information on response tomorrow in our webinar, Renee West and Darlene Spencer.
So I would echo that involving your team in these kinds of resources, particularly the webinar tomorrow, is exactly what you need to do to begin preparing them to be thinking about the important things that are going to make the big difference.
Thank you guys so much. And thank you for joining us for today's webinar, What is Life After Coronavirus, Leading the Reentry Process. We hope today's team was able to provide you with some valuable insight on reentry. If you sign off today and realize that you have additional questions, you're always welcome to reach out to Annie or Guy directly. You can also contact any of our team members by checking out the People section of the firm's website at www.raycpa.com. That's REA. Don't forget to watch your inbox for an evaluation survey, access to the recording of today's webinar, and more. Thank you again, and we hope you guys have a great day.